Hi, good morning. My name is Kevin Wang. I'm from 141. So thank you all for coming. We have lots of chess players here, also lots of chess players in 141. Today is our honor to have Dr. Jim Magner here to talk about his new book, also share his advice. And Dr. Magner is a scientist, a doctor, a husband, father, investor, and a chess player. And he went through college and medical school, married and raised family, and still was able to get in some serious chess play. His new book, which you have now, and provide help to readers who want to live rich and meaningful lives, and who also want to win more chess games. Without further ado, let's welcome Jim.
Thank you very much. So I'm really happy to be here. It's a real privilege for me to be here because I know how skilled and creative people at Google are. I had a problem. I was busy with my career and going to medical school and so on. I wanted to meet girls, okay? I wanted to do something meaningful with my career, and I wanted to, I was ambitious. I wanted to get a good job that had good pay and benefits. I didn't want to be totally materialistic, but I recognized that I would have to earn a living and pay a mortgage and, buy shoes for children. And so all of that is important to keep in mind, but I wanted to keep interests. I'm an amateur astronomer. I collect fossils. I was a Boy Scout, so I had those interests. And I wanted, even though I was an adult, I wanted to keep some of those interests. And then over the years, I accumulated lots of stories because I raised two daughters. I had interesting, difficult patients. I had various crises, as we all do. And I saw that there was, in medicine, sometimes people get burned out and there's sort of some cynicism in medicine. And I wanted to share some of my stories because sort of as a positive message for medical students and trainees that you have to keep your eye on many different things, but enjoy your life and do something productive and be a good citizen and, have fun. And how could I share some of those anecdotes and stories? Because I'm not Henry Kissinger, and so nobody is going to pay to publish my stories, which I thought were valuable. In other words, I felt I had a message, or interesting, and actually nobody wants to read a long, dull book. So I wanted to do something that was entertaining and useful. In other words, anecdotes could be instructive and entertaining and useful. Who's going to do it? Well, I was an amateur chess player. Now I'm an average player that plays in tournaments. So of people that pay $50 to sign up in a tournament, I'm sort of average in that. So my rating is like 1550. Okay. So and part of my problem over the years is I never had time to study chess, really. So I decided over the years I would collect little traps and tricks and so on that I could use occasionally to beat really strong players. And it was fun, although I would usually lose to strong players, to occasionally surprise one of them and beat them. So I thought what I'll do, since I've played for 40 years, that I would collect some of these games where I actually tricked somebody that was hundreds of points better than me. It can happen. And put those together and then interweave the things that I really wanted to publish, which are my anecdotes, and have a chess publisher publish it, and that way I wouldn't have to pay. Because if you publish your own book, it's like $20,000, and maybe electronic publishing is cheaper now, but I wanted actually a book. I'm my age. If I'm going to publish a book, I want a book. So I thought, how could I get this done? So to make a long story short, I sent out samples to 3 chess publishers, and one of them in New Haven, who is a prominent chess publisher, sent me a response it's some intriguing material. Come meet me on Saturday morning and we'll talk about it. So that morning I put on my necktie. I had coffee with my wife, and she said, Jim, I just want to protect your ego because this is a chess publisher, and he's going to tell you, you're an average player, you have a very creative, like a tricky style, so it's you have some intriguing games, but you're kind of an average player, but all this other crap has to come out. And so I said, well, we'll see what happens. So I met with the publisher, and he said, well, Jim, you have an intriguing style, you have tricks and traps, you've beat some strong players, but basically you're an average player, but you probably have too many games. Take some of the games out, but put in more of these stories because those anecdotes are great, okay? So that's the kind of publisher I really needed to meet. So his name is Hannon Russell, and he's published many chess books over the last 30 years in the United States. So he committed the money. Actually, he gave me a one-page contract saying he was going to get 90%, I'm going to get 10%. So I said, so let me say, I played chess for 40 years, I wrote up the games, I wrote up all my stories, you publish it and get 90% and I get 10%. He said, yes, because of course he's putting up the money, he has to earn his money back. And I said, sold. Signed it. So that was, I didn't, so I want to make clear at the very beginning, I'm not here to try to sell anything, really, or I'm not doing this to make money. I feel that I have a valuable message, especially for young medical trainees, or just really any bright college-age person or young professional. And I hope that you can skip the chess parts. If you'll actually look at it over the holidays, it's entertaining, and I think you'll take something away from it. So now I'm just going to read a few excerpts, if that's the way you usually do this. And also, this is very informal, and so you're welcome to even contact me later. I work at Genzyme down the street. I'm an endocrinologist, but I mostly sit at a computer all day. You know what that's like, doing clinical research documents. So in the introduction, I talk about the development of expertise in an area, such as skill at playing chess. Is that the result of innate talent, or is it a learned skill that even an average person could achieve if enough hours of study and practice were applied? Intuitively, many persons believe that innate talent as well as study and practice are required. There's a guy named Philip Ross who came up with the 10,000-hour rule, a hypothesis much discussed in recent years that states that a bright person who wants to have a skill in some area need only study and practice that skill for 10,000 hours to achieve a very high level of expertise. Let me now do a calculation. Assuming that one has a spouse and a family as well as a job and other responsibilities, one potentially might only be able to study or play chess every Saturday afternoon for 4 hours at most. That would commit 2,500 Saturdays or 48 years before one would have achieved significant expertise in chess if the 10,000-hour rule is valid. And that can be a discouraging realization, although I thought it was probable, I suppose, that after only 1,000 hours, some people may be reasonably good. So other people have thought about this too. Charles Krauthammer, who's sometimes on TV, very smart man, he wrote a review, a little article in the New Republic in July 1983 called Joy and Madness at the Board, The Romance of Chess. And he quoted at the beginning of his article H.G. Wells. You have, let us say, a promising politician, a rising artist that you wish to destroy. Dagger or bomb are archaic, clumsy, and unreliable. But teach him, inoculate him with chess. So that's the way to destroy your enemy. For Wells, chess was not just an addiction. Its continuing popularity constituted a kind of heresy. Wells wrote, quote, "The passion for playing chess is one of the most unaccountable in the world. It slaps the theory of natural selection in the face. It is the most absorbing of occupations, the least satisfying of desires. It annihilates a man. So Krauthammer humorously speculated that Wells's ire had been formed at an impressionable age when he had left a rook hanging in an important game, and he postulated that Wells had never quite recovered. So, could be. So one of my themes in the book is that you need to have hobbies, like chess, but don't get so addicted or taken by whether it's swimming or running or whatever your hobby is. You do need to keep balance. You have families, you have children, you have careers, you have other important interests, perhaps with your church or certain charities. And we, Kevin and I, when we go to the chess tournaments, I think we see some rather odd people there sometimes who have spent 40 hours a week playing chess. Wow. And like they barely have enough money to buy groceries, I think. And so it's, one can take things a little bit too far. And also probably the new addiction might be Texas Hold'em poker, which I also enjoy playing, but I see some people at these poker tournaments who probably dig ditches for a living, and for them $100 to sit down and play in a poker tournament, that's a lot of money for them. And they're not thinking clearly in terms of the way they're investing their time. I did well in school, and it's important for the people still in college who might read this to have the priority to do well in school. And I won a scholarship to come over to Woods Hole, Massachusetts to do biology studies for a summer in 1972. That was the era of, you know, a little wildness and free love and all that stuff. I was just in college and at this summer experience, sort of a long way from home in Illinois. I was a good boy, okay, but it was a coming of age experience for me that summer. And I'll read you one anecdote. During the summer of 1972, after my junior year in college, I was awarded a small scholarship to live and study in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. I was to take the summer biology course and complete a well-defined research project in a few weeks, if possible. I joined a group of a dozen bright students from around the U.S. We had a great time both at work and play. During the first week, Dr. Janish invited the students to spend an informal evening at his home. We had some lively discussions about biology, science, and Woods Hole when, at about 10:30 p.m., one of the young ladies from California stood up and shouted, "Let's go skinny dipping." Everyone immediately agreed, and we raced out the front door to the nearby beach. Although I'll admit that this shy and studious boy from Illinois, land of endless cornfields, was trailing in the rear and was quite bemused by this sudden turn of events. So that was one of my first quite memorable experiences. And of course, we did good science at Woods Hole also. In the book, I've been interested in human evolution and genetics for a number of years, and I put some material in the book about that as well. And I talk about DNA and sort of like you've, as probably most educated laypersons know, that all of us share almost identical DNA sequences. Now, of course, the police can track down criminals by this occasional differences in certain areas. But like on page 31, I mentioned that if the long strings of the DNA letter sequences from any two persons were set side by side and compared, about 999 out of every 1,000 letters would be exactly the same in the two sequences. Of the approximately 3 billion letters in each long string, the inheritable differences in each person thus would consist of just 0.1% of the sequence. In contrast, chimpanzees are approximately 7 to 10 times more genetically diverse. Moreover, the genetic differences between a chimpanzee and a human are 20 times greater than the differences between two average humans, even though the overall DNA sequence of an average chimpanzee is about 98.5% identical to that of an average human. The high similarity of the DNA sequences among individual people is evidence that all humans descended from a relatively small group of ancestors, perhaps because many thousands of years ago, the human population went through a so-called bottleneck because of a famine or disease or lack of resources. The bottleneck concept would be more believable if our ancestors were living in a relatively small region so that a famine, for example, could affect the entire location where the ancestors lived. Intriguingly, our direct ancestors possibly moved out of Africa about 50,000 to 100,000 years ago after stopping for a while in the Middle East, and then they spread over a wide area. They followed in the footsteps of other hominids who had exited Africa in prior waves of migration. And these earlier human-like creatures who had migrated out earlier shared a common ancestor with us. But the ones who had emigrated earlier from Africa were not, for the most part, our direct ancestors. In fact, there may have been a little breeding between these separate groups under special circumstances. And then I mentioned in the next paragraph an intriguing theory by Huff and al. From the University of Utah. They looked at so-called mobile elements in the DNA, and they found that about 1 million years ago, there were, based on their mathematical calculations, there were only about 18,500 animals that were human. So we came from a very, very small group, and that's sort of an intriguing story. In medical school, that was also a coming of life experience, and I only played a little chess in medical school. I'd been an Eagle Scout in my hometown of Quincy, so as part of my scouting experience, I had learned to shoot a small caliber rifle, but I'd never seen a gunshot wound. Many patients with knife and gunshot wounds were brought to the emergency room at the University of Chicago, where I went to medical school. And one evening, as I was following a surgical resident around on call, his beeper went off, and he was asked to come to the ER right away to see a young man who had been shot. I rode down on the elevator with the resident, and I was rather uncomfortable, so I was still a medical student then, because I had no idea what this was going to be like. The two of us were directed to an examination room, and I held my breath as we stepped through the door. There on the exam table sat a 25-year-old man looking more annoyed than traumatically injured. He wore a bright purple vest over a lime green shirt and sported a large gray felt hat with a small orange feather on one side. He looked up at us and pointed at his left thigh. The nurses had removed his pants and had applied pressure bandages where a small caliber bullet had entered and also exited his thigh. We unwrapped the bandages to examine the small tears in the skin where the bullet had passed clean through. After a brief medical history, the resident showed me how he could tell that the path of the bullet had not hit the bone, the pulses in the leg were normal, and the neurologic examination of the leg also was completely normal. As I watched with a suppressed smile, the resident expertly applied a Band-Aid to both the entrance and exit wounds, shook the man's hand, and pointed him to the checkout desk. So that was the first gunshot wound I ever saw. Okay, and then I'll just quickly add, sadly, not all of my experiences with gunshot wound patients were as lighthearted. By the time of my 4th year surgical rotation, I had established myself as a smart student who was very precise, well-organized, and highly competent, but unfortunately, in the eyes of my surgeon supervisors, clearly inclined to internal medicine instead of surgery. They brought me one evening to the surgical intensive care unit where a middle-aged woman lay intubated on a respirator with multiple IV lines, a Foley catheter, a chest tube, etc., etc. She had been shot in the chest and abdomen 4 times by her husband and had been stabilized in surgery that day. The surgeons told me to watch her all night, keep track of all the central lines, IVs, medications, blood transfusions, urine flow, chest tube output, vital signs, respiratory settings, blood gases, etc., and give them a call if I had any serious problems. I was thrilled, so a 4th year student, I was thrilled by this opportunity to manage a complicated and very ill patient, along with a skilled nursing staff. And characteristically and quite understandably, The surgeons were thrilled to leave these medical tasks to a bright student so that they could get back to the operating room. Different people are just naturally inclined to different sorts of challenges. All went well until midnight, when a hospital security officer peeked into the intensive care unit to see me. "Hey, Doc, got to talk to you," he whispered. And although I was wearing a white coat, I was not a doctor, just a fourth-year student. "We just got a call that this lady's husband found out she is still alive. So he's grabbed his gun and is on the way to the hospital to finish her off." "Oh," I replied numbly, while holding 2 clipboards and 3 flowcharts. "Just wanted to let you know, Doc, so you can be ready if a man comes in here." He shrugged and then added, "The chief asked me to sit down the hall for a couple hours, so I'll be here." Not feeling much better about the security situation, I kept the IVs running, the blood transfusing, the chest tube draining, the respirator pumping, the urine flowing, and the blood pressure stable all night until I was relieved in the morning. The angry husband never showed up. So that's another story. We also took care of indigent patients in Chicago, and some of them were alcoholics, criminals, down and out people, and they would lose weight, become malnourished, and some of them would get tuberculosis. So we took care of them. On one occasion, a young physician was visiting from England, and we walked him around the ward. While standing at the bedside, I presented to him a case of a man who was improving on anti-tuberculosis medications. The young doctor was incredulous that we were still seeing cases of TB commonly in the United States, since during his training he had not seen one case in England. I explained that our impoverished urban areas still had malnourished or alcoholic or other down-and-out persons with TB. With typical British humor, he responded adamantly, "Not in our slums." So it was interesting to go to medical school in an urban area, dealing with all sorts of people, but still not too much time for chess. But I was beginning to realize a few basic principles about chess as I was playing a few people. One needs to gain a reasonable understanding of the basic chess openings and focus on about a half dozen openings for more careful study. You can't learn every opening. So with the limited time that we have in our lives to do a hobby like chess, you need to be selective and focus on just certain parts of it. In addition to just a few openings, you need to gain insight into important basic chess techniques. The most important techniques probably are practicing king and pawn endings, typical mating nets of the way certain pieces come together, let's say against the castled king, proper use of the rooks, which even top experts make mistakes when you're down to just a king and a couple pawns and a rook on the board. So there are definite sort of physiological rules, the way those rooks and pawns interact. And it's if you know those, sometimes a good player will not be optimally positioning those rooks, and you can beat them. You should keep a record of tournament games and study those games. You can play over famous games in chess history. That's always fun to do. You should get adequate sleep and avoid alcohol the night before a tournament. Learn some opening traps, both for black and white, and be bold-faced enough to actually try them during important games. And so I have 31 games in here. Many of them I won by an opening trap, and it's embarrassing to the opponent if you can beat them in 15 or 20 moves, especially if they're a whole lot stronger than you are. But it's because they underestimated you. You know, you surprised them. They weren't ready for it. We play with clocks, of course, and so you manage your time well during the games, because if you don't do that, you don't really have time to properly think at the critical end stage of the game. Have discipline and remain highly attentive during games to watch for small errors or inaccuracies by opponents. Consider carefully when it may be to your advantage to trade off queens and other pieces to take dangerous weapons out of your opponent's hands, and so on. And so why try some of these? I'm not reading them all, but why try some of these trappy, tricky plays? Is because against a very strong opponent, you're going to lose anyway. So you might as well try something a little bit unusual. If you're playing somebody your own strength, you should probably be very disciplined and play really the most correct way that you can. But if you're playing somebody hundreds of points higher, be a little creative because you're going to probably lose the game anyway. Accept the fact that you will lose to a strong opponent in any case, and you are trying a somewhat desperate strategy to win the game. Keep in mind Teddy Roosevelt's observation, quote, "Far better it is," you can almost see him saying this, "far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much, because they live in the gray twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat." Well, I finished my medical school, and then I had met a girl. She was from Texas, and so I decided to do my internship and residency in San Antonio. So we loaded up the car, her car, and drove to Texas. So on page 48, I talk about that little trip. Things were looking up. I was finishing medical school in 1977. I was engaged to be married that summer. I also had been accepted at my first choice hospital for internship in internal medicine. The drive went well until we were about 30 miles outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. We were on the 4-lane highway, and the Charger started coughing and losing power, so Glenda pulled it over to the side of the highway. We sat stunned for a moment as cars and trucks whizzed by, each one slightly rocking our stalled car. It was still light, although dusk was coming, and there were pine trees as far as we could see. We stood outside the car, and I raised the hood. Of course, this was before cell phones, 1977. For several minutes, the cars sped by, but after a quarter hour, one old, small station wagon passed us but slowed, pulled to our side of the highway, then backed up 50 yards to reach us where we were parked. A clean-cut man in his 30s walked back toward us. "Out of gas?" he asked. "No, the car just lost power," I replied, "so I guess we're going to need a tow truck." We shook hands, and I was certainly glad he had stopped. He said to grab anything valuable out of the car, and then he would give us a ride to the next exit, where he thought there was a filling station and someone could probably arrange for a tow from there. He smiled and then handed me a newspaper he had carried with him, a pro-communist newspaper, red hammer and sickle in the top corner. "I also want to give you this," he said earnestly, "and I really want you to read it and think about it." I was now more stunned than when the car had died. I realized that I was in the woods in Arkansas talking to someone who should be feeling a little out of place in this county. But I took the newspaper, thanked him, and when I reached into the Charger to collect a small travel bag, I tossed the newspaper into the back seat. The ride to the exit took less than 3 minutes, and we hopped out at the filling station and waved goodbye, and I really did appreciate his help. The station owner said that we were in luck since Merle was just bringing the tow truck back to the shop right now, and he would be happy to tow us into a place he knew in Little Rock that could fix our Dodge. In a half hour, a very large tow truck pulled in, driven by a very muscular young man. I helped Glenda up the high step into the front seat next to the driver, and then I stepped up, slid onto the seat, and shut the door. Off we went to retrieve our sick car. Merle told us to take any other valuables out of the car, since he would drop the car at the dealership and then drop us at a nearby motel. This time, as I reached into the Charger, I had a couple of minutes to stuff the communist newspaper into one of my small bags out of sight. I didn't want that in the car where the workmen might see it. Merle raised the front wheels of the Charger and hooked it up. We climbed back into the front seat, and off we went to Little Rock. It was now dark, and within a couple minutes I realized we were going about 85 miles per hour. I looked back, and yes, our car was still dragging along behind. Next, I realized that on the dashboard in front of our driver was a large black pistol without a holster, and next to that there was a 3-inch thick stack of bills secured with a couple of rubber bands. "I guess you are ready for any trouble," I said in a loud voice to be heard above the roar of the truck as I pointed at the gun. "Yep," said Merle. "Okay, if I put on the radio, my favorite show is on now," he added. Not being in an argumentative mood, I agreed, and he clicked the button. The church choir was just starting, "Holy, Holy, Holy," and Merle turned the volume up higher as the engine roared. I think he also picked up the pace to 90 miles per hour. Our car, remarkably, was still attached. The next few minutes were quite memorable as we raced along the highway in the dark, swerving around slower traffic, with the gospel choir on the radio at full blast. Soon we were at the dealership, where we dropped the car by the front door. A few blocks away at the motel, we bid farewell to Merle with our sincere thanks and a small tip, since at that point we barely had any money in our checking accounts. Merle did his job well, and he did it in style, Arkansas style. The next afternoon we had a repaired car and an interesting story to tell. So that was my adventure with Merle. I put in a chapter about my first daughter. Having children is wonderful. There can be surprises. So, show of hands, do some of you have kids? So, okay, great. So, there's always surprises. So, I'll just read a little bit from chapter 7. Aaron was born at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland in January 1981. Glenda and I had joked, remember I said January. Glenda and I had joked somewhat nervously about what might happen if she were in labor just before or during the Super Bowl. But actually, all went well that day. Glenda had to stay in the hospital an extra day because of a low-grade fever, which gave me an opportunity to speak again with the pediatrician who had briefly examined our baby. I told him that I was a bit of a nervous new father, and I was not highly trained in pediatrics, so I asked him please to re-examine our little girl one more time very carefully. That way I would know that when I got her home, if she was cranky or had some other issue, I would be more certain that the root cause was not really a major problem. He laughed and agreed, and all was well. We brought our baby back to our apartment on the 3rd day after her birth, but she didn't take her breastfeedings very eagerly, and she slept quietly most of the time. Others commented how lucky we were to have a, quote, good baby. When she was 10 days old, I came home from work and found Glenda crying because the baby again had seemed not to take the breastfeedings very well and was fussy and crying. Over the course of that evening, I took a look at the baby more with a doctor's eye than a father's eye, but I knew little about babies. I was certain that she had been very carefully examined twice, about a week ago by the pediatrician. But by 10 p.m. I noted that her respiratory rate had increased and she started having what are called rib retractions, an early physical sign of difficult breathing. I told Glenda that I might be overreacting, but I thought that there were objective signs of a respiratory problem, and I suggested that we take the baby to the emergency room. When we arrived at the emergency room, the staff was responsible enough to take a look at Erin within just a minute or two, and they immediately felt that there was some sort of important respiratory problem. During the next 60 minutes, her respiratory problem worsened rapidly, and Erin was intubated and placed in the intensive care unit. The chest x-ray showed fluid in the tissues of both lungs that possibly was pneumonia, and the heart was enlarged. Erin's blood oxygen worsened during the night, and she suffered a cardiac arrest. But after a few minutes of resuscitation, her heart was beating again, and her breathing continued to be supported by the machine. Stunned, Glenda and I sat in the waiting area throughout the night, trying to remain supportive of each other. So I won't go into more detail about all that just at the moment. But Erin then had a horrendous course, but survived. And required some heart surgeries and lots of other things, which make for a short but quite interesting series of anecdotes. And then I put in some photos, including of Erin as she graduated from high school and later got married to her college sweetheart. So it all turns out well. But those sorts of surprises can overtake any family, and you need to be prepared to deal with that. I had a younger daughter, Carly, who was quite skilled and talented, loved to play the piano, and was quite good at it. And she, as a young elementary student, she performed brilliantly several complex classical pieces at a spring piano concert. So I was dismayed that during the following summer months, so she was in elementary school, she decided that she would not practice the piano even one day. In September, so the summer had gone by, I thought that I would teach her a useful lesson about the importance of practice and continued effort. I sat her down at a piano and asked her to please play her classical pieces from that prior spring concert. The smug look dropped from my face when Carly effortlessly played them all nearly perfectly from memory. So I'm not sure who learned the bigger lesson that afternoon. Parents should observe carefully and take to heart a real sense of wonder and awe as their children grow and develop. Human beings are truly amazing. Carly made transitions and so on, and when she was about 16 years old, she joined a group of high school students who were being trained by the local police to go into a bar and order a drink. If the student was not properly carded and was actually given the drink, the police waiting outside planned to move in and serve a citation. Although Carly was a fairly worldly teenager, she actually did not have, at that time, any experience ordering alcohol. The dozen or so students were assembled for an informal training session that included a mock-up of a bar area with a policeman acting as bartender so that the students could practice what they were supposed to say. The police instructor explained that the bar would have hard liquor as well as beer in both bottles and draft. Carly was first at bat, so she somewhat self-consciously stepped up to the mock bartender, feigned a confident attitude, and in a loud voice announced, "I'd like a bottle of draft beer, please." After a second of stunned silence, the bartender and all of the police trainers roared with laughter. Blinking like a deer in the headlights and a little red-faced, Carly listened as they explained her error. So that gives you some flavor of raising Carly. When I was then a young faculty member in Chicago, I had to interview students who wanted to come and be interns and trainees at our hospital. So I had different sorts of interviews. Some were interviews for students who, to get more boots on the ground, I would hire bright students to come work in my research laboratory for the summer. So I hired, the hospital paid for it, so I was happy to hire them. And they always made a contribution. It was fun to be around bright young students. But there was an issue. I had accepted a very bright young co-ed to join my lab for a few weeks. But a month before her scheduled time, she called me and explained sheepishly that she would have to back out of the job. So this is her on the telephone. She said, "I have just won an all-expenses-paid trip to Switzerland for this summer." "Wow," I replied, and I expressed my sincere congratulations. But then I added, actually just in jest, "But if you stop to reconsider for a moment, wouldn't you rather work in my lab in Chicago doing fascinating biochemistry rather than traveling here and there in Switzerland?" She was silent for a moment. So then I added, and consider that Chicago is actually exactly like Switzerland, only flatter. Now realizing that I was just teasing her, we both had a good laugh together. In addition to interviewing college students for summer positions, I also interviewed individually each year about 20 medical students who were applying to be interns in the hospital's internal medicine training program. I really enjoyed meeting these bright applicants, and I was quite interested to see what they were doing with their lives. One of my particular points of interest was to analyze the chronology of what they had listed on their applications so that I could understand what they had done year by year since high school, a period of 8 years for these applicants. Sometimes a little probing would disclose that they had traveled in Europe for a year or had worked on an archaeological dig. During one interview with a muscular young man, I was having difficulty understanding what he had done for one 12-month period where there seemed to be a gap in his CV. He hemmed and hawed a bit, and I still had no clarity after a minute or two. So just tell me, I continued in a mildly stern tone, is that the year that you were in jail? His wide-eyed expression instantly told me, somewhat to my horror, that I must have struck a nerve. But let me explain right now, doctor, he blurted, that it was not really my fault. We finished the rest of the interview in a fairly routine manner, but I'm sure he walked out wondering what amazing investigative techniques had been employed by the hospital to discover his secret. I had only been joking, of course, when I had mentioned jail. As a young faculty member, I had a research lab, and I loved my research, and I loved publishing papers and so on. But the grant process is very competitive, and I got to the point where I eventually just couldn't compete. I was a pretty small operation. I did some good things working on TSH, and of course later I came to work for Genzyme, and they make recombinant human TSH for thyroid cancer patients, and so I've had 30 years of experience working on the biochemistry of TSH, so this was a really good fit for me to move to Genzyme. But at the time, we were under a lot of stress, and as we were unable to support our research, find ways to do it, it was tough times in academics, and it still is tough. I loved a joke that circulated in our department at that time that seemed quite apropos. There once was a remote monastery of monks whose goal was to pray 3 times a day for the salvation of the world, help the poor a little if they could, and teach young boys how to become monks. So this was like a parallel situation to us in academics, where we weren't supposed to just see patients all the time, patients, 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 but we were also supposed to teach and do research and do other things, just as the monks were praying for the salvation of the world, help the poor, teach young boys how to become monks. The monks took pride in being very self-sufficient, so they tended small gardens and eked out a living as best they could. One day, a bright monk came to the superior with the idea that if the monks sold some of the wine they made each year, there would be more funds available to make life more efficient for the community. Even the poor could be helped a little more. The superior approved the sale of wine, and over the next years, the monastery sold more and more wine. Soon it became a booming business. But a new superior became concerned as costs of business rose, and more wine had to be sold to support the infrastructure. The superior asked the monks to pray less each day and teach less each day, and instead spend more time making wine. After a few more years, the superior reached a crucial decision. In order to meet the new quotas for the next year's wine deliveries, the praying and the teaching would have to stop completely. So that was our joke at the university, and then shortly after that I left the university and I joined, as some people said, the dark side of the biotech industry, where we were trying to do clinical research to invent new drugs, to make money, but also, of course, to help patients. That sort of innovation is critical, to have new drugs that will cure diseases. Okay, so we're coming to the end. I put a chapter in about the importance of making and saving money and investing. And it's not just to buy the fancy cars. Having a little extra money in the bank gives you the independence to go to the job you want to go to, even if it's not the best paying job, or to move to the city that you want to move to, even if it's not the best paying situation. It also allows you to tell your boss, that's a good idea, but I actually see it this way, and so please consider it looking at this way. Now, maybe you don't have that issue at Google, but in many places, you do have that issue. And if you are not just worried every minute about what your job review is going to be and so on, it just gives you a little more independence in terms of, not that you're being insolent or a troublemaker, but it just affects the way that you can handle yourself in certain difficult situations. So the money is not the end, it's a tool, a very important tool. And so some people almost go the other direction where they want to be completely non-materialistic and, you know, I'm not going to save any money and so on. But you have to realize as a responsible person in our culture, you have to have savings and investments. And that gives you the ability to be relatively independent of forces that are trying to control you, okay? So I put many, of course I've counseled over the years many medical students and trainees, and they're worried about all the hard work, they're worried about how can I make a living in the future, what should I do? I have a girlfriend in San Francisco, how is this going to work out with my training and this and that? So I would work with them. But one of the key things I always talked to them about was saving and investing and trying to save money. And I loved the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. So let me just read a little bit from chapter 19 about that. So I've made the widely known points earlier about saving and investing sensibly. They're the true keys to accumulating wealth. But there are also other important tidbits to mention. One must study hard, work hard, and make the proper connections so as to optimize one's earning potential. An entertaining and very readable account along those lines has been given to us by Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography. Although this selection might sound formidable, his autobiography is actually a slim paperback volume that can be purchased for about $10 new. He wrote the first part when he was, and then he was interrupted, so he completed the last part in old age. Actually, many scholars believe that the book was not finished. The somewhat old-fashioned language takes only 10 pages or so to get used to, and the authenticity is well worth this minor inconvenience. Frugality is but one of many topics that are addressed. He was willing to leave home and travel to new places. Expertise at reading and writing was vital. He was willing to serve on committees and do other unpopular jobs of that kind, since he actually then could have a direct hand in shaping outcomes of important or relevant questions. Notable was Franklin's skill at being in the right place so as to be the obvious choice when some task had to be done for a fee, such as printing up paperwork for the legislature. His personal reflections on trying to be a good person and his record-keeping sins are delightful accounts. Many educators would assert that this is one book that every American should read, or anyone of any nationality, really, and it can be read in just a few days or during a couple of airplane rides. And so I list that book in an appendix that's on page 173 of what I would recommend, at least for people interested in science and medicine, as key books that might be of interest for, let's say, holiday reading or summertime reading. And they include like The Double Helix by James Watson. A great book is the Discoveries by Alan Lightman. The Discovery of Insulin by Michael Bliss is a great book. A collection of little funny anecdotes that are each only about a page long is Eurekas and Euphorias by Gratzer. That's a great book, especially for airplane reading, because each anecdote is like a page. They're like famous scientists, Einstein, Tesla. I like space, things, and so, I put some books on about some of the great interplanetary missions, sending robots out to other planets. Amir Axel, who I think is in New England, wrote a book called The Mystery of the Aleph. There's a book at the end, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which I bought and read when my first daughter was very, very sick, and of course was having many bad things happen to her. So what does it mean when bad things happen to good people? And in closing, I want to leave a little time for some questions. I added a chapter that's only 3 pages, but these are my closing thoughts. And of course, this book was intended to be about chess, yes, and there are lots of examples of chess games and strategies for trying to trick and win some chess games. But the book was intended to be more about chess. I go on to say, anecdotes can be entertaining, but also instructive and helpful. My hope is that a thoughtful reader might glean practical advice from my ramblings that will prove useful in other areas of life. And I actually have another appendix where I give specific advice, because I've worked with medical students, trainees, and of course 2 daughters. And so I tell them to wear sunscreen, wear a hat, take calcium and vitamin D every day. Money is very important, but don't be overly materialistic. Money is a tool, not an end, and so on. So I put lots of things that I hope young people would see value in some of those things, just like for my recommended books. You can't read all these books, but if you pick 3 or 4 of them to look at, these are not my books, they're books I recommend that I think would be of real value to bright young people who are interested in science or medicine. I talk about, what does it mean if we're faced with a world full of suffering, and which many people claim, that there's no ultimate meaning to any of this anyway. So, what's the point of all this? Why don't we just go out and get drunk? So I quote Isaac Newton, and also one of my favorite authors, Lauren Isley, who probably, if you pick one book off my list to read, and it's very easy to read, it's not highly technical. His old book from a couple of decades ago, The Immense Journey, is a very easy book to read. So I guess the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, which you can read in 2 days, and The Immense Journey by Lauren Isley are very thoughtfully written, entertaining books. So Newton was brilliant, creative, a loner, a supremely hard worker who was willing to pursue scientific investigations and calculations day and night without food or sleep. But he also was concerned about ultimate understandings. And in his treatise Optics, published in 1704, he criticized other contemporary scientists who were trying to banish God, the first cause, as he viewed it, from the proper understanding of the world. Newton writes, latter philosophers, meaning current thinkers now, banish the consideration of a cause out of natural philosophy, he wrote, feigning hypotheses for explaining all things mechanically and referring to other causes to metaphysics. But Newton viewed this purely mechanical approach as flawed. Newton instead wanted to deduce causes from effects till we come to the very first cause. He was comfortable with gravity's mysterious action at a distance, for example, and was content to describe how gravity acted in mathematical detail while admitting that the precise mechanisms whereby gravity exerts its effects remain completely unexplained. Newton wanted not merely to unfold the mechanism of the world, but he also wanted to learn whence is it that nature doth nothing in vain, and whence arises all that order and beauty which we see in the world. And then Isley, I'll just close on a couple quotes from him. Isley, who was a 20th century anthropologist and naturalist, echoes some of Newton's longings for ultimate understanding. Isley writes, "There is no logical reason for the existence of a snowflake any more than there is for evolution. It is an apparition from the final world which contains, if anything contains, the explanation of men and catfish and green leaves." Isley was not enamored of organized religion, but his keen scientific mind also encompassed a profound mystical sense. Quote, "Man is not as other creatures," he observed, "without the sense of the holy, without compassion. His brain can become a gray, stalking horror, the deviser of Belsen." So I would like to close now to entertain a couple of questions. I would encourage you to take a copy, share it with a friend, buy 6 more copies. I make, I think, 59 cents for each copy that's sold. I've tried to write a book under the guise of a chess book that also has, I think, messages that really would be valuable to, let's say, college-age students or young trainees that deserve, even if they don't like what I write, if they'll look at the appendix and look at some of the books I recommend, I think that there would be a lot of value here for a pretty slim book. So let me close there. Thank you again for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.